This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, editorial director, co-founder of Craft Beer and Brewing, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the episode today is Trevor Rogers, co-founder of Garde Brewing in Tillamook, Oregon. This episode is brought to you by craftbeer.com, home of the most powerful brewery locator in the universe. Whether you're traveling in a new city or planning your next beercation, head to craftbeer.com and explore the wide world of American craft beer. Want to support small and independent breweries? Look for the Independent Craft Brewer seal when you search. Trevor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on here. Pleasure to see you as always.
Fantastic. We are here at the Brewers Retreat in Austin, Texas. Trevor has come in to join us down here in Texas. We're sitting at outside at the Austin Beer Garden, enjoying a wonderful Pilsner. Trevor just got off of stage talking with Henry from Monkish for a good 2 straight hours, and we appreciate you talking with us for another 45 to 60 here on the podcast.
I think technically it was 2 hours and 13 minutes, but
who's counting?
Yeah, who's counting?
Giving me the 3 to 4 minute background on your brewing history and what led you to opening Garde Brewing, focusing on spontaneous beers out there on the coast of Oregon.
All right. Well, 3 to 4 minutes is a pretty tight parameter, but I'll do my best. My wife and I come from a home brewing background. Before that, more wine appreciation, wine industry. We had a love for and passion for wild beer, acid beer, and particularly Brettanomyces complexity. At the time that we were making them on a smaller scale, there wasn't a lot available in the market. But we were all obviously thrilled whenever we'd find great lambic or goose or other more domestic producers available to us. After doing that for some years, we realized that we should at least entertain the possibility of approaching this on a broader scale. If we're struggling to find something that we're passionate about, that means that other people are too. And we'd like to try and potentially share that with a broader audience and see if we can't follow our passion in a commercial endeavor.
What year was this?
We first started brewing in 2013, right at the start of the year. I think we started entertaining the idea of opening a brewery at the end of 2011. We, for a time, pulled some yeast trials up and down the coast, targeting that as a likely place for spontaneous fermentation.
Yeast trials. What does that look like?
That's a very good question. So everything we make is spontaneously inoculated and fermented. On a commercial scale now, we run everything through our cool ship, the freshly boiled wort, and it's fermented by the native yeast and bacteria found in the environment, in the air, where we make it. So when we were looking for a location that would be conducive to this, we were taking sanitary to sterile wort, freshly boiled, run through a sanitary chiller into jars, cooling it, and then bringing it to different locations on the Oregon coast for sample inoculation and fermentations. And tracking those over time, we were kind of able to narrow it down to the county we're in.
You just set up jars at various places in open air down the coast of Oregon.
Yeah, to simplify, we just took a sanitary wort to capture yeast and bacteria from the air and fermented that out, and just tracked that by sensory analysis over a long period of time, and finally ended up where we are in Tillamook itself now.
And so that really was what made you select Tillamook as a location. Now, you had some history. You had brewed at, Pelican before that?
This is my first commercial brewing experience.
Oh, okay.
We were fortunate that our ultimate destination was only a 30 to 45 minute drive up the road from us. At the time when we were pursuing this as a commercial endeavor, I was the assistant front of house manager at Pelican Brewing Company down in Pacific City, their original brew pub location. So it could have been a lot worse. We could have had to, move a couple or few hours in either direction. Where we ultimately ended up, though, was a little bit closer to home, although we still had to relocate.
Yeah. So why, as you are inspired to do this, create a brewery with parameters like that. Again, in 2011, 2012, the world of brewing, I mean, there were 4,000 less breweries in the country at that point. Beer was, and there were certainly far less producers of sour, wild, and spontaneous beers in the country. I mean, folks had to think that to some degree this might be commercial suicide, and what on earth are you going to go, do making this kind of beer? How would you find an audience for it? What drove you then to set aside any of the traditional ways of starting a brewery, with a standard beer lineup, and focus entirely on these spontaneous beers?
That answer might be longer than the introduction of our brewery. I had a professor when I was studying to be an art professor who once told me, if you want to make art, you have to not be able to do anything else. It has to be such a large drive in you that you don't have the option not to do it. And I think that's accurate for the craftspeople that I respect the most in a lot of different industries. As far as appreciation and why we went this route, again, coming from a wine appreciation and industry background, the best wines in the world are a very explicit, very direct representation of the location that the grapes were grown and the traditions of that area. I see that same character or characteristic in my favorite beers out there, where they couldn't be produced somewhere else. It's going to be quite different if made, grown, etc. in a different location, which I think is why we ended up making the type of beer we did and sought out a business trying to represent that. Everything we do is trying to be a very specific sense of location and put that into guests and people's hands.
That's a good point. And so you are pursuing that kind of terroir. There are differing goals within the world of brewing. If you look at, on some larger sense, the kind of competition mentality that underlies a lot of the brewing world, there is this idea of pursuing some sort of Platonic ideal for individual styles, and that if brewers work hard enough, they can perfect something along those lines. You are, in a sense, eschewing that entirely and pursuing some sort of focus that is driven by the place you're at and not some ideal of what beer should be. Or is that an accurate representation, or are there still flavor style concerns that you that also mitigate what you do?
I think the best brewers take a more skeptical view that there is an absolute lack of any ideal. Making higher quality is always a goal, but higher quality itself is entirely subjective and intangible. The best thing we can do, and what I think the best brewers do, is entirely try and better reflect their voice or their location through their beer, and try and improve upon that voice itself, versus trying to say this is the perfect, this is the gold standard. We don't have that capability particularly, other than trying to coax more out of nature and work with it. So we can't drastically change our recipe too much. We make minor changes in the pursuit of better representing predominantly the Brettanomyces in the location where we are, so that it gets closer to some theoretical and impossible golden perfection.
So you do have that thing that you're striving after. Can you visualize that taste or that flavor, and do you push towards that and some visualization of that as you design these beers, or are you reacting to what you get from that environment?
Yeah, I mean, most of what we do has to be reactionary. Since we are not the driving force of our beer, I firmly believe that it is location-based. We have to react to what nature gives us and then try and coax it in different directions. As far as seeing that perfection or notion of in our beer, we have blends that we love more than others, that we occasionally get that glimpse of, this is it. We were blending a beer yesterday, and one of the barrels, it just sings. And how best to get that representation, how to carry that, how to nourish that into a stronger and yet better voice is the challenge.
You launched a brewery, and as everyone launches breweries, there are time and money concerns. The beers that you launched the brewery with are not necessarily the beers that you're making now. Talk to me a little bit about how that process changed for you. You, as you launched the brewery, had to make beers that you could sell on a shorter scale, and maybe. And now I know, as you've told me before, the time period that your beer spends in wood has been expanding. The longer the brewery's been in operation, and the resources that you have allow you to do that. What's that process looked like, and how have those beers you make changed over time as a result of that?
Backtracking just a touch to actually answer that question, you asked what possessed us to open a brewery of a mind that we did at the time in the market that we chose to do so. I don't feel like it was really a choice at that point. It's something we felt compelled to do. But in line with facilitating that, no bank would lend us money towards a brewery who didn't have massive expansion plans, whose predominant production was dedicated towards beers that took, their fermentation wasn't measured in months, it was in years. So we had to start with a very meager setup. My wife mixed while I laid the concrete for the floors in our original facility. I did most of the electrical work. Don't tell the building inspector. We did everything we could.
That location's gone now.
Yeah,
so,
it is. It is.
The evidence has been buried.
True. We did everything we could to make this happen because there wasn't any other choice.
Right.
In line with that, we not having really any operating capital, we couldn't go in devoting everything to where our passion lays and where I think the truest expression, what defines our location, lays in the tertiary Brettanomyces character of our 2-year average age blends. We just couldn't put beer into oak for that long for everything. We still brewed the recipes that are nearly everything that we brew today, but in a smaller portion, devoting more effort towards, it's funny to say it, but quick turnaround beers, which for us was like less than a year. So we had recipe
4 to 6 months, maybe quick turnaround in your world for most brewers out there.
I think our first batch that we sold of it drew a lot of inspiration from Berliner Weisse, so we called it Berliner inspired, but spontaneously fermented still, as with everything from the beginning there. I think we were able to turn that around in about 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
That was, I think, the quickest batch we've ever been able to do. But just remarkably, it actually attenuated, developed a character that we were excited about and happy with earlier on.
Sure.
Though, since then, even the quicker turnaround recipes typically were closer to 6 to 12 months with some at a slightly shorter timeline, but it's largely variable. As with everything spontaneously fermented, you lack a lot of control. The best you can do is coax. As we matured as a brewery, we kept devoting more and more of our production as responsibly as we could to still be able to, sell some beer to run our business, but devoting more and more towards longer aged blends with the ultimate goal of ending up more where we are now, where 95% of our beer is going to spend a minimum of 1 year in oak. And the average beer that we release in 2018 is going to spend an average 2 years in oak. In pursuit of what makes the best beer in that truest expression. So no, we've retired recipes that were well received by a number of our fans.
Yeah,
that's never an easy thing to do or decision to make. We wouldn't be here but for their support. But at the same time, the reason we started this in the first place was to try and express the individuality of the terroir, the location where we are, and to my palate, to the best we can ascertain, much less fermentable wort, longer fermented and aged beers do a much better job of coaxing that character, of helping that character develop. So we wanted to express that. That wasn't really it was hard to do, but really it wasn't a choice. I think that's what we felt compelled to do.
How do you, from a artistic creator / business owner standpoint, balance what your consumers want against what your vision is and what you want to brew? There are a number of brewers that balance that in different ways, but for you, how do you do that?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I mean, obviously Henry and I covered that on stage here at the retreat just an hour or two ago.
Yeah.
I don't very well. my wife, being the drastically more pragmatic business person, coaxes me to make some concessions sometimes, but because she's the responsible one.
Right.
I don't really make concessions. I think that an honest pursuit of the best product that you as a person or a brewery can make is always going to have some audience. It's never an easy or fun thing to potentially alienate any individual or group of customers, people that are supporting you. But I also don't think that you're going to do your best work, that you're going to bring the penultimate expression of your capabilities here to fruition if you're pursuing something that you yourself are not proud of and passionate about.
Do you think that consumers can taste that authenticity? That if you were simply trying to create a product that's going to sell more, that they could sniff that out and it may not they may not be able to engage with it in the same kind of way?
Yeah, that's tough to say. A lot of beers that I very much enjoy, I don't know that they have an individual character like that they don't have a relevance to anything else. I think that the very best beers that individually that I have enjoyed, or the very best brewers that I respect, generally are in pursuit of a singular expression, and I don't think that, I know for a fact that the ones that I've talked to aren't just making beer to make beer or to please customers. They're pursuing something, I'd like to say more noble, but that's probably not the right turn of phrase.
You could look at it in music terms. There are pop musicians that build songs that are built by formula because they're going to be radio hits, and and that is what it is, and they can be very successful at that. But if you look at the artists that develop long-standing, passionate audiences, even if they're small audiences, doing and creating something that is exactly what you want it to be and that is heartfelt and is your own creative expression, can build very significant hardcore fans, not because you're trying to find those fans, but because you're being authentic in that expression. And it seems like those are some different approaches that are also applicable to beer.
No, you've got the earlier Beatles and you have the later Beatles, right? Same band doing drastically different shit.
Right.
I favor the later stuff because I think that they were a much more singular expression at that point. They were doing something unique at the time. Versus the earlier pop stuff, I think was easily repeatable by a number of other people. Obviously, they both had huge amounts of fans. Heck, I think the earlier stuff probably had a bigger fan base. I know a lot of the later work was more alienating to a group of people, but kind of in line with your music analogy.
So, but people, at the same time, musicians and brewers too, they grow and they change, expecting someone to be the same thing. And this is, if we're going to take that Beatles metaphor and move with it, the Beatles in the 70s were not the same people that they were in the late 50s and 60s. And as those people change and as their influence and their context changes, naturally their creative expression is going to develop, as well. How, as you think about it, how have you changed in your context? How has that changed over the last, 5 years of running a brewery? I guess it's 6 years now, but...
we're celebrating our 5th anniversary of distribution, starting, next month, right the first week of the month. Which we celebrate the anniversary of distribution because we would have confused a lot of people when they might be trying their first beer of ours and like, hey, it's our first anniversary. Like, I've never heard of you. It changed in a couple ways. It's a great question. One, we've changed in palates and what we want from a drinking experience. I used to be more receptive to more aggressive beers, I think. And I think it's in line with the market turning towards more aggressive beers being more common. I found myself moving away from them. I think they eliminate a lot of the social aspect of it. We've all overindulged on many occasions, but rarely have my favorite times over beer been one where I had overindulged. I prefer the conversation, conviviality, and coherence of beverages over a period of time. In line with that, I look at what I want out of life, and I think my wife is of a similar mind, that we want to encourage good things in people and great experiences people. So we want to provide drinkable beer in pursuit of balanced, lower acid, higher complexity, more introspection, that inspire conversation, but are also equally just as enjoyable and not interrupting conversation because they're not beating you over the head with like, oh, I have to say something, like this is insane.
Right.
Trying to do good in life the same way a lot of other businesses operate. To provide a spark of something beautiful in some small way, seemingly inconsequential, I think, can provide an inspiration throughout the rest of the day, the week, whatever, that ultimately can contribute towards positivity in a general way. So trying to create beer that is excellent, yes, and better, yes, and more balanced, yes, and drinkable, but for an absolute directive of trying to do good.
You mentioned less aggressive beer. That brings to mind for me some questions about consumption mode. So for you as a brewery, you and your wife have focused on keeping prices in a very manageable place so that people can drink these beers, to a large degree as table beers. They're under $20 a bottle, even for some of your hardest to get beers. In that, but at the same time, you have a large number of craft beer fanatics whose consumption mode is sharing these beers within the context of a lot of other beers, and that in some sense has driven, I think, some of that aggressiveness that if you're drinking one of your beers in the context of 30 other beers and, in 1 ounce samples over the course of a night, the memorable things are not going to be necessarily the most subtle and complex and nuanced. The memorable ones are going to be those aggressive beers that kind of jump out of, the overall din of an experience like that. From a brewer's perspective, if you are focused on, those social media beer check-in reactions, you could find yourself leaning toward making those more aggressive beers. But you all, from a value perspective, have instead focused on making those beers, again, less expensive so that people can enjoy them in those social experiences that are maybe small scale and not have to feel like they have to share every beer with 30 of their closest friends. But from a brewing perspective, how do you deal with that? How does that play any role in the way that you design these beers and the way that people consume them?
Man, that sounds like a lot of different inquiries kind of wound into each other.
I'm sorry to make it that complex.
I'll do my best. Where you started with pricing, I don't take any offense with how any other brewery prices their product.
Sure.
In the absence of a claim that it's of necessity when it's demonstrably not. We charge what we have to charge to compensate our team very well and to maintain our business. We did this as out of passion and necessity for ourselves, not out of a pure business sense. To that end, we charge as little as we have to versus as much as we can. I don't think anything inherently noble in that. It's just how we want to do business. By most people's standards, that's terrible business. It's true.
You're leaving money on the table, Trevor.
And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I take more joy out of work, I think, than anything else in what we're doing now. What would more money get me? As far as the tasting more aggressive beers doing well, I mean, yeah, that's been proven repeatedly. We've seen that in the wine industry in the rise of some very prominent critics where they're tasting through 50 to 100 wines, reviewing them. And of course, the more aggressive ones, whether it be sweeter or more acid, they will tend to fare much better, particularly towards the end or after you've already had a few different samples of something. It's just the way your palate works. I'm okay with faring worse in a tasting where people are having 100 sips of different beers, because hell, even if we were the one that they liked the most out of it, I don't think that they would have gotten the full potential out of what we had crafted anyhow. What I would prefer is that we were providing the best experience for the folks who are sharing a bottle with a few friends. We still will sit down and have a handful of beers with a group of people on regular occasions. I relish those times. But I think those are the times where the best beers, the most well-crafted expressions, they shine in those portrayals or those scenarios.
You've talked to me before about some of your influences, out there in the world of beer. And when we talked about your dream six-pack for craft beer and brewing, it was almost entirely, or actually I should say 50% of yours was Belgian Lambic and Goose.
Was it that much?
I think it was.
Yeah, that was a hard list to put together, to be fair. I could have come up with some different variations, but yeah.
Yeah, but you drink a lot more than that.
I definitely drink a lot.
And, and I think folks have this idea, that you might be that, that studious professor that pursues this beer. But you also have a sweet spot for even things like, hazy IPAs and a whole lot of lagers.
Hell yeah. I think you saw my eyes light up when Henry was sharing some Monkish on stage there.
Even though it had Galaxy in it.
Yeah. Well, he's the one brewery that makes Galaxy beers that I can enjoy.
Okay. We should explain that to folks. You do have an issue with the Galaxy hop.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I know they're incredibly popular, and I am an outlier on this, but it's almost like a physical reaction. It induces nearly a gag reflex for heavily hopped Galaxy-focused beers. It's weird. I don't understand it. Yeah, but I'll own it.
What do you have against Australians, Trevor?
I don't know too many Australians, and I've never been over there, so I guess I'm just like building up a hatred ahead of time, prepared.
All right. Yeah. Someone's going to reach out and change your mind on this. Yeah. I guess Henry already has. But.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the reasons he's more educated on the types of beers he makes, obviously.
Yeah.
When he was talking about the time that they spend cold conditioning, trying to mellow the acids contributed by the hops and the character. I think that's the likely reason why I can enjoy his, where it's not a rush-through process. He's trying to make the best beer he can versus the most lucrative amount of beer that he can. I think that shows in the finished product, where even his heavily Galaxy-hopped ones I can still thoroughly enjoy.
Sure.
But, back to your question about, I do like good beer in general. I like good wine. I like good food. I don't think there's a constraint on appreciation of any individual style or representation. A passionately crafted product will almost always be enjoyable to me, and I think to most people. Certainly we each have palate preferences. I'm not a huge fan of cucumbers.
Okay.
For example, so if you serve me a dish that's predominantly composed of cucumbers, I'm not going to love that, even if I can respect that as a well-crafted cucumber dish. Somebody that's putting their heart and soul into what they're making, it's probably going to be something that's pretty enjoyable, unless it's made with cucumbers.
And I've noticed over the last couple of days, you drink quite a few lagers. We were at Live Oak yesterday, and a fantastic lager maker. We're drinking some Austin Beer Garden Pilsner right now.
One of my favorite breweries.
Really?
Oh yeah, man. Austin Beer Garden is fantastic too. Do not get me wrong, but Live Oak, I think there is soul in their beer. That was their Hefeweizen was on the list that I gave you for the Desert Island beers and whatnot. I think that's represented by Chip there, and kind of flows down through him, through his people, and into the beer. Like there's soul and brightness in those, and obviously a continual pursuit of perfection. Not by intent, but out of necessity, I think, from the top down.
and a similar approach to making the beers that they want to make, even when commercial constraints are considered, and that they have a strange dedication to smoked beers. Chip yesterday was saying to us that he's going to make smoked beers until people start to drink them.
Yeah.
But it's, they've got things that make the money, and then they have the beers they want to make because they just want to make them, even if people don't want to buy them.
Yeah, I think that pursuit of smoked beer perfection there, and the repeated brewing and experimentation within that underlines their continual pursuit of their ideals, and I think that's why I love what they do so much. It's not we're going to make great lager just because, or we're going to make great lager that will sell well. It's like, I'm going to do something beautiful today.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about your process, for beers. Now, again, with your current crop of spending 2 years on average in wood, what do your recipes look like? How do you use hops to manage some of that acidity and how that develops in that culture? How have you found, and this is going to, these are different things for brewers wherever they are.
Well, before you keep going too long, because
I'm
you got two questions
I'm gonna
already.
10 things onto this
and
question.
Then I'm going to forget what the second one was by the time I get to the 10th,
Sure.
Acidity is a continual battle. To get to that one first. I don't think we shoot to make sour beer or acid beer. It is a byproduct of how we make our beer in pursuit of complexity and representation of place. It's something that we try and temper as much as we can, and it's a continual pursuit. Folks that have been drinking our beer from the similar, like say, we have a series of beers that start with the.
Right.
If you've been consuming those over the years since we first started releasing them, you'll have noticed a continual decrease in the perceived and total acidity of the beers themselves. That's still continual. I don't think we're quite there, although a lot of the beers are pretty happy making to me at this point. But we're not trying to coax that in. As far as recipe and how we address that, the hopping rate is one of the biggest ones. So we have slowly and continually increased our use of aged hops, which do provide a fair bit of IBU still and preservative character along with antibacterial properties. We've transitioned our oak vessels, much to the chagrin of my wife, into larger formats, which are much more expensive. So our smallest vessels that we're targeting right now are 500-liter oak puncheons versus 225-liter wine barrels, which are cheap and easy to procure.
Sure.
With the half of our capacity now in 1,000 and 2,000-liter oak casks.
So, but why do that? And I mean, there are, from a production standpoint, it's certainly more efficient to use larger vessels, but it's way cheaper to use smaller wine barrels if you look at, cost per liter.
There are pluses and minuses. If you have a wine barrel go south on you, it's a lot cheaper to replace it too.
Yeah.
But no, we pursue these slightly larger vessels, not going to the extreme. We're actually selling off 392 barrel foeders and like, nope, too big, back off. The larger vessels have a lower surface to volume ratio. They're less oxidative during aging, so that they produce a more gentle acid profile in favor of a more delicate and nuanced expression of Brettanomyces particularly. Do keep some standard size wine barrels around, but they're gin barrels from Ransom Distilling, who's just up the road from us. We really love their Old Tom gin, and contrary to most wine barrels, even though they're the same size, those ex-Pinot Noir barrels that they then age their gin in, I'm assuming it's an antibacterial property in some of their botanical blends, rarely develop an aggressive acidity. So we'll always keep those around when we can procure some of them. Yeah.
But from a production standpoint, certainly more labor involved in racking out of those smaller, barrels. But from a cost perspective,
yeah, they kind of balance each other out, I think. Okay. Like the cost of replacing larger vessels is higher. The maintenance and production costs of filling, emptying, and just maintaining smaller vessels is higher.
Yeah.
I think over time they kind of average out a bit more. Certainly it's easier to, if you need something on the fly, get some standard size wine barrels from a reputable winery or source,
Right.
To fill in a gap. If we have some puncheons that go south, and we retired I think 12 of them last week, it'll be months before we can find that quantity again, if not longer.
You just mentioned that you found, 92 hectoliter food was too large?
92 barrel.
Or 92 barrel, okay.
Yeah, we brought them in. The anticipation was that we would run some beers through there that we could use the economy of scale to offer beer for a lower price, have an even more affordable option. It turned out that I didn't love the beers that we were getting out of them as much.
Huh.
I think that the expression of our beers when they are blended, taking multiple different ages, multiple different batches, and trying to create a harmonious union is a better expression than a single fermentation vessel. And since we don't have 184 barrel blending tanks, pretty much a 92 barrel tank is what you get.
Right, okay.
And even then, that's a multiple days of packaging off of that, running that into a blending tank when it's not actually being blended, it's just transferred over for that.
Right.
And then packaging that. It also it decreased the quality of life for our team. Nobody likes running a fairly manual packaging setup for 3 or 4 days straight for 8 hours a day. And a lot of the choices we do make, as long as it's still in pursuit of making the best beer that we can, are to provide a quality of life to our team, so that they can come into work excited every day and devote their attentions to trying to do good and do well for the beer versus just not being stoked on being there.
So you design, products and processes around employee happiness in addition to end product taste?
We'll sacrifice some efficiencies as a business to make sure that we're taking the best care of our employees that we can. We salary all of our staff from day one, and we work everybody 40 hours a week. That's pretty uncommon in a lot of breweries.
Sure,
in most
sure.
breweries now. We have friends that regularly working like 60, 80 hours, putting in like 12 to 16 hour days on occasion. I don't think that's conducive to having like a healthy personal life, which in our experience from not having that when we first started our
Sure.
brewery and being understaffed and undercapitalized, I don't think you can do your best work in those conditions. So you can do a lot more work if you spend a lot more time, but the quality of work itself, I think, suffers, and therefore the product. And since we're all in our brewery, every one of us, to do the best we can, not just as much as we can, we want to encourage that type
Right.
of work.
Right. Do you brew year-round?
We do not. We've slowly been trimming it back. We used to occasionally knock out a couple batches during the warmer months. We found that at least half of those barrels were ultimately getting dumped for being too aggressively acidic. And we wanted to produce more balanced beer, of course. So as a business decision, that's a terrible one. But in pursuit of greater beer, we brew for, I'm thinking we'll see about 6 months this year.
Okay.
Which is longer, I think, than most of the Belgians are brewing now, or somewhere in line with that, I suppose. But our average temperature has been increasing in our area pretty significantly too. So we've been trimming back not just from the hottest months, but from the ones on either side of that as well, where we might not be dumping half of the beer, but it's still a too significant portion. And the ones that, while fine isn't good enough. Yeah. And I don't think I followed through on the thought completely about the larger vessels. So the oxidative capabilities of smaller barrels, in and of itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You take a bourbon barrel-aged strong ale of some nature. Some of the oxidative reactions that happen in that barrel are of benefit to that beer over time, as long
Sure.
as it's not too aggressive. For us, because of how we inoculate our beer, there is Acetobacter in there. So one of our challenges is to, well, one, it can't be hot, and
Right.
two, we can't have too much oxygen, the two things that Acetobacter requires
Yep.
to produce acetic acid, vinegary character. The larger vessels maintain temperature much better. They're less oxidative, so we're removing the two things that produce acetic acid. So even in beers where that acetic level was below threshold, If you have more in there, it will contribute to an overall impression of greater acidity. So we're trying to combat that.
Right.
I think some amount of acetic acid is essential to the character, even in the best lambic and goose. Obviously, more pronounced in Flanders
of course,
acid beers, but we want to have the overall impression be more delicate.
You have moved from brewing more year round to now knowing what your brewing window is.
Approximately,
yeah. and that will most likely also continue to change, but there's certainly a lag time between when you do brew and when you can taste enough of an effect of what that temperature may have had on that beer. Well, how long? I mean, are we talking a couple of months? I mean, you're going to brew in and then and then start sampling that beer and say, hey, listen, this kind of temperature is just not going to work for us, and you will then have to dump that beer. How long do you sit around and have to wait to have that knowledge?
Well, we don't taste anything until a bare minimum of 3 months in oak. At that point,
so you will waste 3 months on that beer as it sits in wood before you're going to make even your first judgment on that.
The vast majority of beer that we produce, we won't even try in the first year.
Wow.
That's pretty much the youngest thing that we work with at this point, the youngest component. And I think anytime you are jostling a barrel, working on a barrel, you're just disrupting what is otherwise a fairly peaceful slumber, conducive to making a very gradual progression of character.
Right.
So you can be as gentle as you want. I think it still cumulatively can be detrimental to the final product.
Sure.
So yeah, that's why it's such a long process for us to make any incremental changes in the brewery. If we up our hopping rate yet again, which I don't think is going to happen, I'm pretty happy with what we've been seeing. We won't have the final outcome from that for quite some time. But to the summer brewing, or warmer temperature brewing, it's pretty easy to ascertain if you pull a sample from a vessel in that first year. If it's already notably acidic, it's going to be too acidic. We don't expect a large development of acidity as we are currently brewing in that beer until much later in its timeline as Pediococcus asserts itself. If you have lactobacillus or other bacterial contributions earlier on, it's because you just had way too damn much bacteria in the environment, attributed largely to warm weather in that case.
That's an interesting piece, and and I guess one worth kind of exploring a little bit. What you're saying there is something that we know a bit from lambic and goose, that dramatically under inoculating these beers with spontaneous culture actually produces more pleasant characters in those beers over the long run. That having too much presence of additional bacteria actually is a negative thing.
Yeah, no, I think most lambic brewers and blenders would tell you that they're not in pursuit of acids. Most of them are still continuing to dial back the levels of acidity in their beers as well.
Yeah.
To the chagrin of a number of consumers over there. You talk to some of the older drinkers, and they're effing pissed because this is not what I grew up with.
Right.
Acid's a byproduct and something to be tempered. Encourage nature in a pure expression of location versus a pure expression of a couple bacterial strains. A more complex profile. So, yeah, we don't expect an early development of acidity. If it's there, then the further progression of that is going to happen still. I mean, Pediococcus, which has a longer leg because of the diminutive cell counts, a longer reproductive timeline, it's not going to not produce acid, in the 8 to 16 months, at least at our brewery, of aging, because lactobacillus created a bunch of lactic acid at the beginning. It's just going to throw more at it. A concentration of bacteria during warmer weather will, by necessity, lead to an average lower quality in our eyes of beer.
Is there something to that low amount of bacteria that allows specific ones to outcompete over that long run? Because you're in a lot of ways dramatically underpitching anything when you spontaneously inoculate. it provides a much longer runway for the small amounts of the bacteria that do end up in that wort to establish and create something without being outcompeted by some of those negative forces that you're talking about.
Certainly. There's I think there's been a reasonable amount of study done on lambic fermentations. We certainly have had a lab pull some stuff from ours as well. But you see that slower progression of different organisms over a longer period of time that I think is a necessary route to getting a better expression, a more unique expression from the beer itself. So, it's fairly well understood at this point that you have an early enteric fermentation,
right.
A very not good, unhealthy fermentation unless you pre-acidify the wort, since we're adverse to adding shit to our beer. We don't. So you end up with that enteric fermentation. Later, Saccharomyces, potentially some lactobacillus, start acting upon the wort, within the few months. And then you move on to a Pediococcus and Brettanomyces dominated phase. We haven't found on average that any of the three Brettanomyces unique to our environment are particularly dominant until at least a year in, and most of the time their best expression comes well after that.
One of the challenges, when we talk about spontaneous beer, and we'll wrap this up, we won't dig into this too deeply. One of the challenges, that I hear from other brewers is that even when you start talking about Belgian lambic and goose, there are a variety of different processes around sanitation and different mentalities towards what they even consider spontaneous fermentation. There are certain lambic and goose makers in Belgium that clean their barrels with chains, and there are others that rinse with hot water, and then there are those that fully steam and completely kill everything in their wood before they add a new spontaneously.
Well, as close as possible anyway. I've yet to find a barrel that somebody can make sterile.
Sure. But there is some thought that while there's a claim of spontaneity to some of these processes, not all of them are as spontaneous, quote unquote, as others are. What does your process look like on that, and where is that balance between pure spontaneous inoculation and realistically, legitimately, keeping some sort of house flavor and culture, moving forward? It's
an interesting discussion. You certainly can have a pure spontaneous fermentation, having done it in stainless on a smaller scale. We don't in our brewery, obviously. We find sanitation and cleanliness to be as important for us, at least. And I think our favorite brewers and blenders seem to be some of the more clean ones on average. What we don't want, the same way we don't want a bacterial dominance from brewing during hot weather, we don't want a single culture asserting dominance during the fermentation. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make bad beer, but I think that it is a less great expression than the delicate interplay of multiple different organisms over a longer period of time. So to eliminate the possibility of having a monoculture assert dominance in any fermentation, you have to be clean and sanitary. How do you do that with wood? I think we all have different processes to do it. We don't steam. Multiple reasons, but I do believe that our procedure is a very effective way at getting as sanitary a barrel as possible. We touched on earlier during the conversation inside, but we'll go through and take a 500-liter puncheon, for example. We'll take a spray ball under high pressure, 192 Fahrenheit water, and wash that aggressively with half of the total volume of the barrel. So 250 liters going into a 500 liter. That tracks with the different size vessel. So we'll double it for twice that size, quadruple it for 4 times the size. After that, we'll refill it entirely with 192 Fahrenheit water. So even with the temperature sink of the wood, you've already taken away a lot of the temperature differential just by running that half the volume through there. The wood on the exterior is at a sanitary temperature. Do I believe that kills everything? Well, I can prove it doesn't, but
right.
It's about as close as you can possibly get. When we're ready to fill it, we'll empty it. If it's been sitting there for more than a day, we'll rinse again with that half the volume, and then cool for at least an hour, so that we're not running cool wort into a hot barrel.
Right.
It seems to track well. We have some amount of consistency in our ferment, and we see not a lot of fermentation that's derived from a singular organism. You can track progression over time, which I don't believe happens the same way when you do have a dirty barrel or a single yeast or bacteria that is doing the bulk of the work.
Interesting. So, what's next? What's on the horizon for Garde? What is exciting you the most these days? And on the flip side of that, what keeps you up at night?
I think it's the same answer to both. I'm always excited for barrels, blends, and such that we have. Like trying to do better, trying to make excellent beer. I stay up at night worrying that that's not happening, or that it's not going to happen. That something out of my control, whether it be natural or economic, is going to remove my ability to continue in the pursuit of continually offering better beer to people.
Economic, what do you mean by that?
If we had some devastating natural disaster that wasn't for some reason covered by our insurance, if consumers decided someday that, wow, Trevor makes terrible beer, his team also is just not keeping him in check, they're doing terrible work, that is largely out of my control again, because we're pursuing what we think the best expression we can present is, and not necessarily targeting what the broadest consumer base is going to be appreciative of. So, economic side.
So you are still saying that despite your position in the world of spontaneous and wild and sour beer in America, you worry about people continuing to care about your business?
I worry about people continuing to care about the beer.
Okay.
As long as the business can pay its bills and then we can take care of our folks with us, then I don't really care about the business side of it. I mean, we're doing this for the beer. I guess that's inherently tied to the business, don't get me wrong, but I think there is a difference. No, I don't think we'll ever reach a point of comfort where we're doing well enough and there's not room for improvement and a necessary need for improvement. And I've gotten that from, some of my idols in the industry. I think the first time I made it over to Belgium, Armand de Belder at Driefontein was kind enough to take quite a lot of time talking about process and his thoughts on beer in the industry itself. And one of the last things he said was that you can never be a good brewer if you think you're making good beer. I agree. If you are content, then you will never do better and are quite likely to just start doing worse.
That sounds like a fantastic place to wrap this up. What an interesting and beautiful sentiment all at the same time. Trevor, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Where do people go to learn more about Garde Brewing?
Tillamook would be the natural place to go. Our new tap room just opened out there, along with our new brewing facility. Not a massive expansion, but it's a heck of a lot better place for us to take care of people that do make the drive out. Our website has a little bit of information. We're pretty low priority on social media, unfortunately. But you can always email us if you have any questions. And we try and be as responsive as possible as a small team.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for joining me today. This episode has been brought to you by craftbeer.com, home of the most mouth-watering map in the world, the map of U.S. breweries. If you find yourself in a new city and want to sample the local flavors, or if you just want to marvel at the vast American beer landscape, visit craftbeer.com. Join us next week for another episode. Thanks again, Trevor. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.